All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Bull's Head Bookshop. Glad you could join us on this beautiful spring day in Chapel Hill. Our guest today is the William S. Newman Distinguished Professor of American Literature and Culture here at UNC. He's the author of many books, including American Transcendentalism, A Glimpse of Zion's Glory, and Jonathan Edwards' America's Evangelical. For 10 years, he was editor of the journal Early American Literature. He is a member of the Society of American Historians, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and the American Antiquarian Society, and the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. And today he's with us to share from his new book, Truth's Ragged Edge, The Rise of the American Novel, which is from FSG Publishing, and available here at Bull's Head for 20% off. Copies up here and behind the sales desk. Please help me welcome Philip Gura.
Well, I'm up here with the children's book, so this is a good place for me. I've given other little talks here, and I think the best way to approach the subject is maybe to ask why I got into this particular project. We've been teaching the American novel for over 100 years. You would think that we know what's there, but the problem is that we really continue to fall back on the same line of interpretation that we really have since the 1920s. So I decided that I would look into a much wider range of novels than that to which you're usually exposed in your college classes or even in your own general reading. So I'm going to sort of go back and forth between a couple things. One is a little essay that's going to be coming out soon about this, and then I'll try to read a little bit from the book as well about some of the more interesting people I think I've discovered or recovered in some way. Why do we need a new history of the American novel? Haven't we known for decades which books are important? In a way, yes, but this has led in basically one direction, making readers miss or misunderstand what 19th century Americans found and appreciated in fiction. The recent recovery of novels that early 20th century arbiters of taste no longer thought worth reading demand such a history, and their widespread dissemination through digitalization now makes the task easier than ever before. When I began this project about 10, 12 years ago, I didn't write it over all those years. But it was at a point where you still essentially had to read these things either in rare books libraries or on microfilm. Now you can literally sit at your desk in the class I'm teaching now, a graduate class. We're reading some of these novels literally on our computers in the classroom. So anything that I've been mentioning today you should have easily accessible to you. A whole range of novels by women, African Americans, long forgotten white men are significant because when placed aside those of James Fenimore Cooper, Herman Melville, Mark Twain, and others, who even now receive the bulk of attention on reading lists, they delineate important and neglected tangents to the constantly evolving sphere of American culture. How many novels were published in the U.S. between 1789 and 1850? 25? 100? 200? In fact, there were about 2,800 in those years. And when one extends the net to include those published through 1875, one adds nearly 3,000 more. So almost 6,000 novels, of which we usually read about 8 or 10 as we think about this field. And which authors come to mind? Most of us can name a dozen or so, unless we've done graduate work in literature, in which case we might be able to add 20 more. But now that Google Books and other open source digitalization projects bring the archive of American fiction into anyone's iPad or desktop, literary historians have to explore how some of these books, in addition to offering engaging characters and compelling narratives, help to explain more about how Americans understood who they were and what they were doing. So you might say, did you read all 6,000? No, I didn't read all 6,000, but there are in fact bibliographies that list all of these. You can look through that and ascertain much simply from the title. You can then go to either digitalization or microfilm and begin reading topics of interest. But the problem, of course, is one of finding a story. You don't want to try to describe what's going on in so many hundreds of novels. I guess I've probably read about 500 to 600 of these things over the last 12 years. So what's the story? How do you find a story? What kinds of things are most important? Let me suggest that. Oh, by the way, if you're interested in the title, my subtitle here comes from Billy Budd, Melville's Billy Budd. He says that truth uncompromisingly told will always have its ragged edges. I take him to mean that it is difficult to comprehend, let alone write of truth in any fullness because of its complexity and ambiguity. And my reading of early American fiction is attentive to authors who made an honest attempt to capture that fullness. In any event, when you're thinking about how to organize this, you tend to think about what you've done before, how you understand American culture to that point. And as I got more and more into this, I was amazed at how what I was reading went fairly closely with what I had learned when I did my book on American Transcendentalism. I'll explain more about that in just a sec. But as a way of framing this, I'll recur to some religious history, particularly as presented by a friend of mine who claimed, as I said to my class last evening, that the most interesting thing is how people thought about themselves in, let's say, 1800 was very different from how they conceived their inner lives in 1860 or 1870. In 1800, the most common way of talking about yourself was as a soul. You had something internally, you had something that was your essence. In the 1820s and 30s, the word that began to replace that was character. You had a character, and a character is something that you partially construct, and you construct a character in relation to the mores of a society around, rather, in which you live. Again, you're taking your definition primarily from something external to you. And finally, by the 1850s and 60s, in religious understanding, Richard Rabinowitz said that you finally have people talking about personality, about uniqueness, about how each individual is different from any other. And this is actually what you find as one of the arcs in American fiction. I'm not trying to claim that this is the only way to understand this range of novels, but it is in fact true that over the course of 50 or 60 years, you follow that same trajectory, first from novels that have a deep basis in religious history, then to novels of what we call the sentimental or domestic, in which one's moral character is at the center of one's attention, and then finally to people like Melville, and more importantly for my purposes to some women who were writing in the 1850s and 60s, Elizabeth Stoddard and others, who began to express their joy in the specialness of every person, the uniqueness of every person. Ahab in Moby Dick says that in the face of the personified impersonal, a personality stands here. And that's Captain Ahab putting his fist against the universe at that point. Well, then other things begin to click. Consider this. After you, I have an opening part where I talk about the great changes that occurred over the early 19th century. And then among these is one that Emerson himself noted. He said, when he was talking about the religious tumult of these years, he said that this was a time when the mind had become aware of itself. He said that beginning in the 1830s, there arose a new consciousness based on the belief that the individual is the world. This perception, he said, cut like a sword and led to an age of severance, of dissociation, of freedom, of analysis, of detachment. The youth, he said famously, were born with knives in their brain, a tendency to introversion, self-dissection, and anatomizing of motives. And that, of course, is a way of thinking about the great novels, I think, of people like Melville in particular. They are dissecting motives in a new way, particularly in a way that is moving forward into a kind of psychological formulation rather than one based just in moralism. So this notion that the mind was becoming aware of itself, as I went through, I began to notice how certain authors were in fact interested in self-consciousness in very special ways. Now, as literary historians and countless teachers in high school and college who depend on them to tell it, The reigning trope in American fiction centers on a compelling male figure who confronts head-on the wonder and vastness of the wilderness. Think of Natty Bumppo, the deer slayer in the wilderness of New York, Ishmael on the frightening anonymity of the sea, or Huckleberry Finn lading out for the territories. In the 20th century, other solitary individuals join that parade. Hemingway's fishermen and big game hunters, Faulkner's young Isaac McCaslin, James Dickey's misfit adventurers in Deliverance, to name but a few. To delineate American literature by connecting these dots is to see one's countrymen, and they are always men, as eternally facing west, renouncing the complexity of civilization for the purity of the wilderness. But when one explores the larger archive of the American novel, this view rapidly gets out of focus. For the American psyche was really not fixated on escapist fantasy, but formed in encounters with a much more recognizable and social world conditioned by changes in American life. The Western landscape in which the American Adam wandered occupied a very small part of the national imagination. And again, we have essentially been told, certainly I was told, that people like Cooper, when you move from Cooper to Hawthorne to Melville to Twain, these people really were the ways to think about American civilization in the deepest ways. They captured things about America that were most important. But in fact, the great majority of novels have nothing to say about that. So when one begins to go into this other grouping, in the most populous regions, transformative change and not timeless essence was normal. Between 1800 and 1850, for example, the population grew from 4 million to 31 million, many of them recent immigrants. There were extra-legal imperialist adventures into Central America and the Caribbean, an ill-gotten war in Mexico that saw Texas join the Union, and on and on. The inventions of steam power, telegraphy, photography, altered perceptions of time and space, and widespread religious upheavals fractured the once solid foundation of Christianity. A more capacious survey of American fiction uncovers alternative character types who chart the magnitude of such changes. The city businessman who loses his fortune and has to readjust to work at the bottom rungs of society. The recently widowed woman with 2 young children struggling to make ends meet in an uncaring city. The free African American in New England who is the butt of prejudice and cruelty at the hands of those who use and abuse her as a domestic. The woman intellectual who writes for philosophical magazines, rejects the bonds of marriage, and moves with her lover to Europe to escape America's small-mindedness. A wealthy urban gentleman sunk in sybaritic depravity who meets secretly to indulge criminal fantasies. A mixed-race family that tries to make a new life in the North until racial prejudice and physical violence shatters their middle-class dream. And on and on. When readers look into these works, rather than those that featured a Natty Bumppo or a Captain Ahab, they were much more likely to see themselves. More surprisingly, these novels also bring us face to face with dozens of fictional characters remarkably like us. We don't really think of ourselves as Natty Bumpos today, I think. Urban, introspective, worried about moral survival in an immoral capitalist society. Here are people who cannot escape change but have to confront it with the same mixed results that characterize such encounters in any age marked by rapid change. The early American novel thus contains nothing less than a new genealogy of American anxiety. The reader who willfully ignores this in favor of a more comforting and escapist fantasy on the frontier is guilty of self-deception. Long silenced voices in American fiction demand incorporation into a new inclusive history of the American novel. So that, in a sense, is where I think the book takes us in one of its trajectories. I pay much attention to the urban spaces. For example, if we say that the domestic novel is based around the home, is based around the hearth and fireside, we have to come up with, against the fact that many people were now living in boarding houses. They were living in residential hotels. They didn't even have homes. How can we talk about the domestic in the same way if this certainly very different environment is now the place where the family has to exist? This business of altered notions of space and time you could get from Boston to New York. in a day at this time. Previously, it took over a week to make that same kind of journey. Telegraphy, you could make announcements about the Mexican War that were transferred literally in a few minutes rather than waiting days before the news came through some kind of courier. So all of these things were impacting these people and, in fact, become the subject of these novels in this period. Let me read another interesting quotation from Graham's magazine. In the 1850s, a reviewer said, commenting on the ubiquity and variety of the novel, that there are political novels representing every variety of opinion, religious novels to push the doctrines of every sect, philanthropic novels devoted to the championship of every reform, socialist novels, philosophical novels, metaphysical novels, even railway novels, that is suited to be read on the railroad, sort of what we call a supermarket type fiction. Today, in the same decade, a reviewer in Putnam's wrote, "Novels are one of the chief features of our age. We would not know what we would do without them." So they became a way of encountering this new environment, not of escaping it, not of simply dreaming that one was on the frontier, but of actually picking up certain kinds of lessons for how one could live in this very transformed environment. The other key arc, so to speak, has to do with that quotation from Emerson. It has to do with this business of self-consciousness. I also think that what happens is that by the 1840s and 50s, particularly the 50s with Melville and Elizabeth Stoddard and others, this stress on personality is beginning to worry people because of the implicit egotism that it implies. One of the sort of great hangovers in this period is the notion that you belong to a community, that you belong to a society, you have a role in it, and you have a personal life, but you also have a larger social life among your townspeople and your fellow citizens. This gets strained when you have people stressing their own individual will, their own individual desires, perhaps at the expense of the larger community. So what I trace and what I end with it in the arc toward the end of the book is this notion that there arises in the 1860s and 70s after the war, voices that start calling people back from this self-centeredness and asking them again for a different kind of commitment to the health of their society. Let me just read something to that effect. In the late 18th century through the 1870s, many American novelists made a conversation about the nation's values the subject of their work. This conversation began and ended in religious sensibility, specifically with the implications in a new century of the still influential synthesis of Jonathan Edwards' theology. The question of the nature of true virtue that Edwards had explored so brilliantly took on new meaning. For the democratic ideals that the colonial patriots unleashed the democratic ideals that the colonial patriots had unleashed could not help but affect moral behavior. The nation defined more and more by an individualistic ethos in a rapidly expanding market economy was now at the center of attention. The cultural synthesis that emerged in the early 19th century included a belief that good citizenship entailed sympathetic identification with those in need, be they orphans, the working poor, slaves, or women economically, legally, and psychologically enchained. The country's deification of individualism led to significant shifts in theological reasoning as well as in civic behavior. The result most visible in a virtually wholesale acceptance of personal agency as well as in the momentous shift from a theology of intellect to one of feelings. Personal agency meaning that you believe in your own free will. You believe in your own ability to affect your salvation. You believe in your ability, as Emerson said, to make your own world. That was the American philosophy as it was emerging. Methodist itinerants, Presbyterian revivalists, Free Will Baptists, these and others embraced free will and a religion of the heart, with emotion the centerpiece of faith. Their emphasis on self-development and its corollary, self-control, received an added boost from the selective adoption of European romantic thought among intellectual groups like the Transcendentalists. Some, however, Novelists and readers both began to question those forces of political and cultural liberation, realizing how they frequently led to callousness about the fate of others and thus to an unhealthy division between individual well-being and the good of society. Many American novelists creatively addressed this growing bifurcation, first evident in the merger of Protestant evangelicalism with a culture of sentiment. They pointed out the sin of egotism and the self-serving nature of the self-regulation counseled by religious groups like the Methodists. Crucially, some of these writers offered alternative visions of the good society, dissecting individual character and motivation and often placing them in a religious framework. Through their novels, they contributed to a particular dialectic that subsequently marked American culture. This dialectic led not only to William James's stream of thought and his philosophical pragmatism, but to Walter Rauschenberg's and Washington Gladden's social gospel, to John Dewey's concern with society's influence on personality, to Jacob Riis and Lincoln Steffens' muckraking investigations into the country's labor. American novelists in the first half of the 19th century, many of them still little known, produced remarkable and remarkably complex fiction. But the harsh truth is that even after the cataclysm of the war, the United States remained unique among countries in a schizophrenic emphasis on the individual and his feelings, as well as on the Commonwealth and one's obligations to it. Witness any debate in Congress today. That Americans still debate precisely the relation of the individual to society does not imply that these writers failed to frame the debate properly or to argue their positions cogently, but that despite their searching criticism and moral correctives, the nation continues to believe in the virtue of democratic liberalism, even in view of its often destructive results. Yet the ghost of Edwards and his contemporaries and his conception of the nature of true virtue will not be put to rest. Making the mind aware of itself is not enough. It must become aware and concerned with others. Trying to encourage such awareness and concern was the burden of American fiction in its first century, and it remains ours. So that's my peroration. Jump into the conclusion of the book. And I think this, as I said in my aside, I think this is still utterly central to the way we think about ourselves. We have people who are libertarians, and we have people who believe in the New Deal, and those are the same positions that were being presented here by these novelists in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. We were unable, in a sense, to come to any kind of closure about how precisely the good individual is to behave in this society. So the book has indeed a religious cast, and I think it's fair to say I see these novels as entering a conversation in a way that makes them didactic. I've seen one advanced review of the book, and someone objected to my lack of concern about aesthetic matters. Well, I really have to say I'm not interested in this book in aesthetic matters, but indeed in the work that fiction does for those who read it. And that's what I try to understand by my own training in history. So if there's a question, if you were going to take many of these books onto a desert island with you, which ones would you take? Well, we might have to still take some of the ones we recognize, but if we're interested in how fiction actually helps to compose what the nation is at a certain point in time, I think it's utterly essential to read more widely in this fiction. So the book is meant, it's not filled with critical jargon. It's meant to introduce you to a wide range of writers, and as well to the historical concerns that the historical pressures really that we're forcing these writers to move in these directions.